Hello there. Welcome to this week's episode of Did Shakespeare. My name is Cassidy Cash, That Shakespeare Girl, and this week we're going to ask the question, did Shakespeare go to school? So big shout out to a friend of mine, Larry, over at Shake and Bake Cast. He is the one that suggested this topic for this week. He asked, hey, so I'm a teacher of Shakespeare and my students want to know what Shakespeare would have learned in school. And so today we're going to answer that question by taking a look at whether or not Shakespeare went to school. Shakespeare is not well documented. So there's no list of attendance that says for sure where he went to school. So we kind of have to use evidence from history to piece together what we think might have happened. And that's what we're going to do today. There are some people who claim Shakespeare was not well educated enough to have been a good playwright, that he couldn't have written his fabulous works that we have today because he didn't know enough. He didn't learn enough in school. And they make this argument because we do know that Shakespeare did not go to university. He didn't go to college in the sense that we think of today. Now, that's a little bit of a fallacy since we know college today is not what it was in Shakespeare's time. So it wouldn't have necessarily been needed for Shakespeare to go to university at all. But the interesting part about Shakespeare's grammar school experience is that when you look at what he would have studied, it was more than sufficient for him to have been an expert playwright. First, you're going to want to know something about Shakespeare's background. He was raised in Stratford-upon-Avon, and his father, John Shakespeare, moved to Stratford when he was about 20 years old. He was a glove maker, and that was kind of a big deal because in Elizabethan England, they had what's called sumptuary laws, which means Queen Elizabeth basically told everybody what they had to wear and what they could eat based on their class station in society. So you had to follow these laws. So a glove maker wasn't just keeping you fashionable, he was also keeping you out of jail by making sure that you only wore what you were allowed to wear for your class station. So John Shakespeare already enjoyed a position of prominence because he was a glove maker, but when he was moved to Stratford, he married a lady named Mary Arden, William Shakespeare's mother, in his mid-20s. And as he married her and was building his family, he was trying to move up in Stratford. So he got a job as an ale taster, and that morphed into him being a councilman, an alderman there in Stratford. Now, you can go ahead and make the connection there from how you go from drinking beer to working for the city government, but that's what he did. Once he's of a high enough standing and he becomes the alderman in Stratford, his sons are allowed to go to school. Now, girls didn't go to school at all, and that's a whole nother topic, but girls were not allowed to go to school. But William would have been allowed to go to school, and it would have been a privilege and an honor for him to get to do that. It's generally considered unlikely that John Shakespeare would have decided not to send William when it was provided. There wasn't the kind of public education we have in the United States now where you can just go to school. If you live in a particular city, you can go to that city's particular school. You couldn't do that where Shakespeare was growing up. You had to have a certain position in society and you had to be a boy. So William is thought to have gone to King Edward VI Grammar School in Stratford-upon-Avon from the time he was 7 until he was about 14. When he was 14, his family got hit by a horrible financial time. His father got in a whole lot of trouble. This was a highly tumultuous time in the history of England, and if there was tension between the Catholics and the Protestants, and there were all kinds of rules and regulations about running a business, and you had to follow all these things correctly, and if you made the wrong person mad, everything imploded on you. So When William Shakespeare was about 14 years old, his father got into a whole lot of trouble. And most historical scholars believe that at 14, John Shakespeare did actually pull William out of school. While he was in school from 7 to 14, the really cool part about what he studied is that he studied a massive amount of theater. Now, when you look up Shakespeare's Education and you start reading about what Shakespeare would have studied, lots of people will tell you that he studied Latin and Greek, which he did. And there was a big focus on translation. Students would be required to do a massive amount of memorization, and they would have to do oral recitation where they would memorize a whole bunch of Latin and Greek, and then they would have to speak it to their class or their teacher and prove that they had memorized it. They also had to do a lot of reading. They would study particular authors and those particular authors' writings, and they had to prove that they understood those. They also did a massive amount of translation. They would translate Latin into English, English into Latin. In the upper years, they would translate Greek to English and English to Greek. Translation and writing, grammar, and parts of speech were all common quizzes that they would give to students to prove that the students had understood this material. There's a really funny scene in the play Merry Wives of Windsor by William Shakespeare where he outlines one of these quizzes where an adult is asking a young child about, do you know this? Do you know that? And it's all about different parts of speech and different conventions of Latin language. And the student, who is quite ironically and probably on purpose called Will, has to prove that he knows these different things from the classroom. Now, students in Shakespeare's day went to school 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday. They were only off on Sunday, and they had to go from about 6 in the morning until about 6 in the evening. So it's 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And it was divided up into about 5 parts. You had your before noon classes, your afternoon classes, and then one little evening sort of section there before you went home for your dinner break. The morning classes would usually start with oral recitation and memorization. Then afternoon, you would have your study of particular authors. That was divided up into 2 parts. You'd have one author that you studied, and then you would study the second one. And at the end of the day was usually when students were required to do the translating and the writing and the grammar. These educators weren't just torturing them, they were trying to train these students with marketable skills. And just like we do today, we tell students that we're training you to grow up and be functional in society. Well, it turns out educators in Shakespeare's day were trying to do the same thing, because Latin was called the international language. Now, what that means is businessmen and medical professionals and people who do a lot of traveling around to a lot of different countries would use sort of an international language. It was like, okay, we're all going to agree to learn this one thing so that whether I'm doing business over there, I'm doing business over here, or I'm trading or whatever I'm doing, we can all communicate being from different countries. And it was called an international language. It was the business language. We kind of have that today with English and Chinese. Those languages are trade languages. A lot of people speak them when they have to do business all over the globe. In Shakespeare's time, that language was Latin, and the students were learning Latin for that purpose. A man named Charles Hoole did a massive amount of research into what Elizabethan education would have looked like in Shakespeare's lifetime, and he wrote out all of the different sets of curriculum that students would have been required to study. Now, the curriculum itself was decided by the reigning monarch. In Shakespeare's life, that monarch was Queen Elizabeth I, and she got to decide what all of the students studied, and so all of the teachers would have taught this curriculum. Basically, Charles Hoole's argument is if I know what this school over here studied during that time period, it's highly likely that that's what Shakespeare would have studied because it was all standardized. The Queen decided and said, here's what everybody's going to do. And some of the authors that the students were studying were famous Greek and Roman playwrights. That's right. The most famous dramatist in the world spent his grammar school years literally spending 12 hours a day studying drama. The Latin and Greek authors that Shakespeare studied while he was in grammar school include people like Seneca, Plautus, Ovid, Cicero, and Virgil. And these people were not only great philosophers and statesmen, some of them mathematicians, but they were also dramatists. They wrote plays for a living. And the material that Shakespeare would have been reading in his grammar school classroom were the plays written by these dramatists. In Roman times, when Seneca was writing and Plautus, the theater represented the voice of the people. It was the way that the people could express their opinion about what was going on in government. And the theater was this funnel that they used to put those emotions out there and to comment on what was going on. Major theater conventions that we see in Shakespeare's work and praise him for were actually conventions that were common in Roman theater. Things like using the chorus to tell you things, or having a minor character overhear a conversation by some of the other characters on stage for the benefit of the audience. That was done in Roman times. Shakespeare didn't make that up. Plautus, in particular, was famous for having developed some of these conventions when he adapted Greek plays to a Roman audience. One of the Roman playwrights, named Terence, was even famous for having used one of the conventions Shakespeare's famous for. It's the idea of the prologue. Now, you may know that at the beginning of a play, a prologue comes out and tells you what's going on. In Romeo and Juliet, it's the person that comes out and says, "In fair Verona, where we lay our scene." It's that guy that comes out and prepares the audience for what you're about to see. Traditionally, the prologue offered a preface to the play, which is basically like, "I'm about to show you a play." You know, it's just a introduction. Well, Terence was famous for taking that a little step further and twisting the tradition and changing it just a little bit. Instead of just giving an introduction, Terence wrote in that the prologue's job was to plead with the audience, to talk with the audience, and to say, "Hey, I want you to know this about what you're about to see, and I really want you to ignore my reputation and listen to the thing on the stage instead of paying attention to what you may have heard about the author or the characters." And this kind of conversation with the audience that the prologue was given was a convention that Terence came up with. And so Shakespeare would have studied this guy breaking with tradition and coming up with this really cool way to use the common theater convention of the prologue. Additionally, Roman plays had a list of typical characters, and it was 6 to 8 characters that were sort of standard. And it was like a template for writing a play. If you're going to write a good play, it needs to include these 6 things. And it includes a lot of common characters that Shakespeare includes in his works as well. It's hard to imagine he wasn't using the Roman plays as a model for what he would write eventually. Now, where Terence was known for writing comedies in Roman theater, Seneca was known for writing tragedies. In fact, Seneca's own life ended in tragedy when he committed suicide, and it was such a dramatic tale that it's featured in a lot of prominent pieces of art all over the world. Seneca is just this hugely powerful character, and it's interesting that Shakespeare, when he was in grammar school, studied both tragic theater and comedic theater, and then ended up in his professional life going on to write both kinds of plays as well. Shakespeare even references Seneca in one of his plays. In Hamlet, Polonius declares, "Seneca cannot be too heavy, nor Plautus too light. For the law of writ and the liberty, these are the only men." And that comes from Hamlet. Polonius makes this statement. And so obviously we have written proof from Shakespeare's own play that he knew about Seneca and Plautus and was studying these people's works and using what he learned from them in his plays. There are 57 references in Shakespeare's collected works to the Greeks and 45 to Latin. Shakespeare writes 13 times about the Greek mythological figure Hecuba, who was the title character in a play by Euripides. And Shakespeare's Macbeth bears a striking resemblance to Euripides' play called Medea. Be cautious when you study Shakespeare and you hear someone say that his 7 years of grammar school might not have been enough for him to become a great dramatist. Obviously, that is not the case at all, because Shakespeare spent 7 years studying 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, of some of the greatest theatrical minds in history. Today, they will tell you that it only takes 10,000 hours to become an expert in something, and over that 7 years, Shakespeare would have logged over 26,000 hours doing the study of famous Roman and Greek plays. So he was an expert almost 3 times over. What can we learn from this? Pay attention in school, and reading is very important. Take a lesson from Shakespeare. He was well educated and studied some of the classics and went on to learn from their wisdom and use their legacies in the building of his very own. you so much for joining me today. If you enjoyed this lesson on Shakespeare's Grammar School, please hit like and subscribe. And I want to let you know, over at the website, CassidyCash.com, I have a free 2018 wall calendar. It is Shakespeare themed, featuring all kinds of quotes and famous historical pictures for your Shakespeare enjoyment. If you want, you can download that for free at CassidyCash.com as my gift to you this holiday season. May you have a Shakespeare-filled 2018. Thanks again for being here. I am so glad you joined me, and I'll see you guys next week.